Again, we're doing the best that we can. And I believe that we're doing things still that are acceptable to God. Wednesday, we began to talk about a new theme or idea that I'm going to revisit on Wednesday evenings and, Lord willing, on Sunday evenings. Every book of the Bible in a word. To try to introduce for us, if I can, the books of the Bible, 66 of them in particular. And we're going to take this opportunity to try to summarize these books and give us a good working understanding of each of the books of the Bible as we have occasion and opportunity to do it. And we talked about Genesis, which very simply is a book of beginnings. And then we move, of course, to the next, which is the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus is a book of power. Now, I could have chosen a number of words to describe the book of Exodus. Of course, Exodus means an exit, to leave, and so we understand that. The book of Exodus, as I was reading some introductory material about it, many commentators threw out a number of different words. Words like law were words that were thrown around. As I mentioned in this morning's sermon, we might even use the word stubborn or the word disobedience to describe it because of some of the things that we're going to notice. But I've chosen the word power. It's my estimation that the book of Exodus represents, as well as any other book, God's miraculous power. But not just His miraculous power. We know about the 10 plagues and the miracles that those demonstrate. But there is power of all sorts from God found in the book of Exodus. And so what I'd like to do this evening is I would like to march through and notice each of those instances. And again, our word is power. And something very amazing happened. Now, I think it's amazing, and you may not. As I was outlining this sermon, the first few points just naturally began with the letter D. And as I began to work through this outline, I began to realize that it was indeed possible for every single point to have the letter D. And it happened almost by accident. And so I thought, as a preacher, that turned out pretty well for me. So each of these is going to begin with the letter D. So let's begin then this evening. Number one, power directed. And I chose, this is one of the few points that for which I did not immediately have a D word. But what we see here relative to God's power is the idea of providence. If you go to Exodus chapter 1, perhaps you're familiar with the circumstances, the situation that was taking place. Pharaoh was concerned by the growing numbers of the children of Israel as they were servants in the land of Egypt. And so he made legislation that every firstborn every male child was to die. In verse 16 of chapter 1, when you do the office of a midwife, he told the Hebrew women, and you see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Verse 17, the midwives feared God and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. They refused to do it. In verse 22, he charged all his people, saying, every son that's born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. And so now, in the course of time, chapter 2, Moses, the man who had become Moses, is born. And his mother has a decision to make. Is she to follow the edict, the command of Pharaoh, or not? And we're familiar with what she does, and we don't have time to get into all of the intricate details, but she makes an ark of bulrushes, a small vessel, and she places the child in the vessel, and she puts him in the river. And then she stations her daughter, Miriam, in such a circumstance that she could watch as that ark of bulrushes floated down the river. Now, too much happens in the course of time for it to be mere coincidence. You see, because it just so happens in verse number 5 of chapter 2, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river at that very moment. Right when Moses was floating down the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. When she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." And notice what happens in verse 7. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. So what do we have here? We've got a circumstance where this child will be reared with all of the advantages of Pharaoh's court, and yet will be cared for by his own mother as the nursemaid for the child. What a demonstration of God's power. But God didn't have to work a miracle in chapter 2 to accomplish His purpose, to accomplish His will. He worked instead through providence. He directed the events through the actions and the decisions of the people involved. How many times in our lives can we look at our lives, and certainly not definitively so because we don't know the mind of God, but how many times can we look at our lives and say, "See, there is the power of God." Not in some miraculous fashion, not that the laws of gravity or the laws of physics were suspended on our behalf, but because God accomplished His will through the actions and the decisions of people living and breathing upon this earth. God's providence. We see in Exodus 1 and 2 then power directed. In Exodus 3 and 4 we see power doubted. Doubted. See, in Exodus chapters 3 and 4 we have the famous interaction between God and Moses. God called Moses to be the deliverer of His people, and Moses had excuse after excuse after excuse. Excuse number 1, verse 11, "Who am I?" Excuse number 2, "Whom shall I say sent me?" Verse 13. Excuse number 3, chapter 4 and verse 1, "They will not believe me." Excuse, finally, number 4, "I'm not eloquent." And then to get down to, as they say, the brass tacks, he just finally says in verse 13, "I don't want to. Send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send." Excuse after excuse after excuse. Now, why do I say power is demonstrated there? Because in reality, do you know what the problem is between Moses and God at that moment? Moses isn't fully convinced of God's power. Because if he were, there would have been no excuses. Just an illustration of that is the exchange between Moses and God there in chapter 4. He says, "They won't hearken unto me," verse 1. And in verse 2, he says, "What is that in thine hand?" And he said, "A rod." And God demonstrates His power through that rod. And the point is made very clear to Moses. God has all the power that Moses will ever need. And if God says Moses can do it, then Moses can do it. Power, doubted, and yet still present. Power directed. And then number 2, power doubted. And then number 3, power demonstrated. Well, this is one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power ever. Beginning there in Exodus chapter 5, we see the beginning of what has become known as the 10 plagues of Egypt. They begin in full force in chapter 7, and God lays the foundation of that through Moses in those first 2 chapters, 5 and 6. We could go very quickly through the plagues, and we don't have time to deal with each of them one by one. But if we look at those plagues individually, chapter 7, beginning in verse 19, the rivers turn to blood. And it's interesting that each of these plagues takes a similar pattern as it unfolds. God says, "Let my people go," through His servant Moses. Pharaoh says no. Moses says, "Okay, there's going to be a plague." The plague comes. Pharaoh agrees quite often, and then he changes his mind. Rivers to blood, first plague. Second plague, the frogs, beginning there in chapter 8 and verse 1. Verse 15, what is Pharaoh's response? But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, when the plague ended, what did he do? He hardened his heart, and he hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said. If you're to read through chapters 7 through 12, then you'll see some instances in which it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, as is there. And you'll see some instances in which it said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Those statements really relate to the same idea. God placed before Pharaoh choices, and it was Pharaoh who made the decision. God can be said to harden his heart because it was he who placed the decision before him. But it was Pharaoh who ultimately makes the decision in each instance. And in each instance, Pharaoh decided not to follow God's directives and instead to exercise his stubbornness and his unwillingness to serve the God of heaven and to recognize Him. And so the plagues continue, and they demonstrate with might and unquestioned authority the power of God over everything, over all of the physical world. God has complete and utter control. And then we all should be familiar with the climax of this event. You go to chapter 11. The Lord said unto Moses, Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. And afterwards, notice what He says. He will let you go hence. When He shall let you go, He shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. He says, I'm going to do something that's going to make Pharaoh escort you out of his land. And that's exactly what happened. It's on this instance, as you're familiar, that God instituted the Passover. And all of those who had the blood on their doorpost, the angel of death passed over their home. But those who did not, the firstborn in that household died. In verse 29 of chapter 12, it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne, unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. And verse 30, notice how it describes it. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. A great cry in Egypt. For there was not a house where there was not one dead. And then and only then, verse 31, He called for Moses and Aaron by night, and He said, Rise up and get you forth from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord, as you have said. Also take your flocks, your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. The same Pharaoh who said, Oh, you can go, and then changed his mind. Oh, you can go, but not all. Oh, you can go, but what are you going to take with you? Oh, you can go, but where are you going to go? Finally says, Go, I don't care where, and take everything you've got. And the neighbors of those Israelites even gave them other things, treasures to take with them on their journey. God demonstrated in a very powerful way His power over everything. Power demonstrated. But as we continue, after we move past those 10 plagues, we see power diminished. Now, what do I mean by that? Power diminished. Does God's power diminish? Does His power lessen? Absolutely not. What do we mean when we say that God's power has diminished? What I mean is the people diminished God's power in their own eyes. Chapter 14 of the book of Exodus. The nation of Israel has witnessed 10 plagues, 10 demonstrations in the mightiest of ways of God's unequaled power. And yet, Pharaoh had a change of heart. And verse 9 says, The Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and chariots. This is Exodus 14, verse 9. And his horsemen, his army, and he overtook them encamping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth before Baal-zephon. Verse 10, and when Pharaoh drew nigh, notice what happened. The children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. And I want you to notice their response. I want you to notice what they say. And they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away, notice this, to die in the wilderness. How much trust do they have in God's power right now? The same God who delivered the 10 plagues surely could deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, but they don't believe it. Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, continuing in verse 11, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. What distrust in God's power. Certainly they diminished His power in their own eyes. In chapter 15, they do it again. Verse 22, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. You'll know that they crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, and then the walls of water close back in over the army of the Egyptians, and they're destroyed, and Israel is spared. And then in verse 22 of chapter 15, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. They went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they were 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah because they were bitter. Marah means bitter. In verse 24, and the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And they cried unto the Lord. Why can't they just understand the power of God? Why do they choose at every turn to, in their own minds, diminish God's power? He could conduct the 10 plagues. He could deliver them from Egypt, but He can't deliver them from the army of the Egyptians. But then He did that as on dry land across the Red Sea, but He cannot, surely He cannot give us water. But He can. And He did. Time after time, God continued to demonstrate His power, and time after time, it continued to be diminished in the eyes of the Israelites. Chapter 17, the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of sin after their journeys according to the commandments of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. And what do you suppose they did? After God had demonstrated His power in the 10 plagues, after God had demonstrated His power for them crossing over the Red Sea and then destroying the armies of the Egyptians after them, after God had demonstrated His power in providing water when the waters were bitter, surely they believe. No, they don't. Wherefore the people, verse 2, did chide with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, why chide you with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water. And the people murmured against Moses and said, wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? Just like they said in chapter 14, just like they did in chapter 15. In verse 7, notice that he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord. Notice what they said, is the Lord among us or not? How horrible it is that the nation of Israel, time and time again, witnessed demonstrations of God's power. And yet time and time again, refused to give it the proper attention and respect in their own minds. And therefore they diminished the power of God in their own minds and in their own lives. How many times have you and I maybe been guilty of the same? Now our God chooses to deal with us differently than He did the Israelites. I'm not expecting 10 plagues or the miracles that were performed in other circumstances, but our God has power. The same God who delivered Israel from Egypt can deliver us. But a virus overtakes the world, and maybe our faith is shaken. The economy becomes weakened, and we begin to doubt and we begin to fear. And certainly there is doubt and there is fear that's warranted and understandable in the circumstances. But our God is still a God who can deliver. Let's not diminish His power. You go to Exodus chapter 20, power delivered. Here it is the case that He delivered His power in the Ten Commandments, a demonstration of it. All of God's law encapsulated in these 10 words, the Decalogue. And we're familiar with the Ten Commandments, and for sake of time, we will not go through all of those. But here is Moses on Mount Sinai receiving from God the summation, the most basic elements of the Old Testament system, the Old Testament law. Certainly we're not bound by the Ten Commandments in specific ways today. All but one has been updated in the New Testament. We're not commanded to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, but the rest, Jesus in particular, in the Sermon on the Mount, updated and expanded. And so we recognize then that we have an obligation to follow God's will just as Israel did. And here you have a demonstration of His power in delivering His law. Here's my law, and because of my power, follow it. Follow it. As we continue in the book of Exodus, we see something quite amazing. God's law, or God's power rather, dwelt. You remember back there, as we were going through chapter 17 and verse 7, remember that question by Israel, is God among us or not? You connect that to Exodus chapter 25. And I want you to look in particular in verse 8. He says, let them, that is the children of Israel and those skilled laborers in particular, let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. God said, I desire to dwell among my people. God's power dwelt. Now, unfortunately, the nation of Israel is going to sorely misunderstand this idea as they continued. They became convinced that as long as God was there in the tabernacle, as long as they had the Ark of the Covenant, that everything was okay. And certainly God never intended that to be the case. But God desired to dwell among His people, to tabernacle among them. You know, I don't believe it's any coincidence that as we turn to the pages of the New Testament, and as we go back to that wonderful passage in John chapter 1, in verse 14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt, tabernacled among us. And we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Our Savior dwelt with us on earth. And representatively, God dwelt with Israel. And you know, a good portion of the rest of the book of Exodus is devoted to the specific instructions relative to the tabernacle. And then to the record of them building the tabernacle. Notice how specific God was in His instruction. And again, we won't take time to read all of the specifics relative to the building and the design of the tabernacle. But God was so specific. His direction was so minute in its detail. God demanded and expected great things from the nation of Israel. And so often, unfortunately, they fell and failed to live up to the standard that He has set. And there's no greater example of that as we close than Exodus chapter 32. Moses has been on the mount. And meanwhile, something had been going on at the base of the mountain. In verse 1 of chapter 32, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go up before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we know not what has become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And he said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink. And they rose up to play. What a horrible, horrible event that transpired. And we could spend a good deal of time dissecting this situation to find out really what went wrong. You know where it begins? It begins with Israel's perception of God. I want you to look back at verse 1, Exodus chapter 32 and verse 1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount. They continued to say, For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt. Who was it that brought them up out of the land? It wasn't Moses. It was God. Moses was merely the representative of God. He was merely the means by which God communicated His desire to the nation of Israel. But Israel was so confused as to who God really was. And that was really the fundamental problem. You see, they wanted something tangible. That's why they said, Make us a God. We want something that we can see, that we can touch, that can be right in front of us. So the first problem had to do with the Israelites' conception of who God was. But the second problem was certainly a leadership problem. Why, oh why, did Aaron agree? Aaron, who would be the first high priest of God, why did Aaron agree? I'll never really understand that. You know, Aaron had the most pitiful of excuses. As you continue in Exodus chapter 32, in verse 22, Aaron said, Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. Thou knowest the people that they're set on mischief. He blamed the people. For they said unto me, Make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we know not what has become of him. And he said unto them, Whosoever has gold, let him break it off. They gave it me, and I cast it in the fire, and there came out this calf. That's not exactly how it happened. He claims that he just threw the gold in the fire, and the calf just popped out. When in reality, in verse 4, he received them at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool after he had made it a golden calf. See, there was a leadership problem. Aaron, number one, wasn't willing to stand up to the people and say, No, this isn't how we need to do this. And then number two, he wouldn't take responsibility for his part in the circumstances. Dear friend, I cannot say it enough that we live in an unusual time. That's the best way I know to describe it. It's unusual. For many people, it's challenging. For many people, it's frightening. For some people, it's dangerous. But we cannot and must not follow the example of the Israelites. And in times of crisis, in times of impatience, lose our understanding of who God is. Our God is still the God of power. He's the same God who created the world, who made man out of the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. He's the same God who raised up a nation in Egypt in captivity and then raised up Moses to deliver them out. He's the same God who performed 10 plagues to finally once and for all prove to Pharaoh that He was the God of power. The same God who parted the sea. The same God who provided water. The same God who would provide manna from heaven and direction and guidance and victory. The same God who provided His Son so that we might all be saved. The same God who watched as that Son hung on a cross. The same God who willingly did all of that so that you and I could have an opportunity to be in heaven. If there's a word in Exodus, maybe it's the word power. And dear friend, we still serve a God of power. But do we believe it? Do we believe that our God can see us through this time? Can see us through any time? Now, I cannot guarantee that all of our circumstances will be easy. In fact, I can probably guarantee the opposite. That there will be times of challenge and difficulty. There will be times of loss and heartache. But I can promise you that our God will be there through them all. And therefore, as Paul told the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 4, we can sorrow, but not as others who don't have any hope. Because God provides for us hope. I mentioned that the Word became flesh and dwelt and tabernacled among us. You know, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul mentions our earthly house of this tabernacle. You see, a tabernacle really is a temporary dwelling. And God dwelt in the tabernacle temporarily. And then they built a temple, and that too, in all of its variations and intimations, was temporary. Because there will come a time when God won't need a temple, when we can be with God in eternity, for eternity. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven. And dear friends, every day ought to remind us that this world is indeed not our home. We are just passing through. But I want you to notice the conclusion that Paul reaches in this context in 2 Corinthians 5. In verse 10 he says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body in this tabernacle, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. Knowing therefore the terror of the Lord," verse 11, "we persuade men." Dear friends, we are not long for this tabernacle. And we all have a destiny that awaits us when this life is over. Hebrews 9:27 reminds us that it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. The final and ultimate demonstration of God's power. I hope this evening that you are convinced that we serve a God of power. And I hope you are convinced that our God of power desires to aid us and to help us with that power, that unimaginable, inexhaustible power. But dear friend, I hope that you're ready to face that power when judgment comes upon us all. If there is anyone that has a need, and I've said it enough that you know, we can't come forward physically, but you can certainly reach out to us. And if you need to obey the gospel, if you need to be buried with Christ in baptism for the remission of your sins, Acts 2:38. if you need as a Christian to once again turn back to God, then we would love to help you. I hope that you understand just how powerful our God is, and that you make the decision to serve Him. Let us pray.